Welcome to the deep dive. We've got an incredibly intense, really provocative journey mapped out for you today.
Yeah, intense is definitely the word for it.
Right. But before we get into the weeds here, I just want to ask you to take a quick second to like and subscribe to the show.
It really is the single best way to help us keep bringing you these massive, comprehensive explorations of, the most fascinating source material out there.
Exactly. So today we are unpacking a brand new, highly controversial ebook. It's called Consensus of One by Conrad Riker.
And if you want to dive into the text yourself while you listen or, after we finish, you should definitely check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
And make sure you follow the author at Conrad Riker at Substack. That's Conrad N. Riker.
Because this text, it absolutely requires this level of in-depth analysis.
It does. Our mission today is to dissect what is essentially a dense, philosophical, and really unashamedly aggressive manifesto.
Yeah, Riker has explicitly written this book for men's rights activists, the red-pilled community, and specifically for men who are trying to understand the history and the architecture of modern Western institutions.
Right. His core argument is that you have to understand these institutions as they existed before, well, as he claims anyway, before they were completely captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
So the goal of this deep dive is to hook you into that core thesis, to really unpack his vocabulary and thoroughly explore what he calls his blueprint for exit.
We want to lay out the sheer scale of his argument so you can understand the mechanics of his worldview. And then, if it intrigues you, you can buy the book to read his formal logic for yourself. Yeah, before we go one single step further, we have to issue a crucial mandatory disclaimer to you, our listener.
This is really important.
The source material we are covering today contains highly, highly politically charged content.
Very charged.
And we want to be explicitly clear right up front. Neither of us is taking a side here.
Right. We're not endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the ideologies presented in this text.
Not at all. We are acting entirely impartially today. Just think of us as your expert guides through a very controversial landscape.
Our job is simply to report on the contents of the ebook. We're here to convey Conrad Riker's original ideas, his logic, and his arguments exactly as they are laid out in the source material.
We're examining the architecture of his thesis to understand how it's built, not validating whether it's right or wrong.
Exactly. We're just looking at the blueprints.
Okay, with that established, let's unpack this thing. The book opens with a diagnosis of what Riker calls the epistemological emergency.
And this is where he introduces the concept that actually gives the book its title, right?
Yeah.
The Consensus of One.
Yeah. The argument here is that modern society has essentially been overwritten by a hive mind mentality.
He paints this picture of a culture where millions of nominally human individuals are no longer engaging in independent reasoning.
Not at all.
Instead, they're just reciting identical manufactured catechisms. Riker points to corporate HR jargon, university diversity statements, and coordinated social media outrage as his evidence.
The assertion is that people aren't speaking their own minds anymore. A centralized consensus is speaking through them.
To explain how this works, he actually reaches back to Hans Christian Andersen's classic 1837 parable, The Emperor's New Clothes.
But he maps it directly onto the modern culture war.
It's a very specific mapping, too. In Riker's framing, the red-pilled man or the dissident operating within the manosphere is the child in the story who just simply points out that the emperor is completely naked.
Right. And the weavers who are spinning these invisible magical garments, those are tenured academics spinning abstract social constructs.
And the emperor himself represents the institutional consensus.
Yeah, and the really crucial element of the story for Riker is that the child is immune to the social pressure that's forcing all the adults to pretend they see the clothing.
Which brings up a fascinating question about human psychology. Why do all the adults pretend to see the clothes?
To explain this, Riker uses Solomon Asch's famous 1951 conformity experiments.
Right. For those who aren't familiar, Asch put a single participant in a room with a bunch of actors.
He showed them cards with lines of different lengths and asked them to identify which line was the longest.
Right, a very simple visual test.
But when the actors deliberately and unanimously gave the obviously wrong answer, a shocking 75% of the real participants eventually denied obvious visual reality and just agreed with the group.
And this is where Riker applies a very controversial evolutionary psychology lens.
He notes that in various replication studies of the Asch experiment over the decades, data suggests that women conform to group opinion at significantly higher rates than men.
From this premise, Riker argues that women are evolutionarily wired for social cohesion over objective truth.
He claims this makes them the natural biological enforcers of this modern consensus through mechanisms like social policing, HR departments, cancel culture.
Wait, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Because mapping an experiment from 1951 involving lines on a piece of paper onto the complex behavior of modern corporate HR departments, that is a massive leap.
It is a huge leap.
How does he justify making that connection without it just sounding like a predetermined grievance?
He justifies it by zooming out to the ancestral environment. Riker argues that the evolutionary trait that kept early human tribes cohesive was the intense fear of social exclusion.
Right, because in prehistoric times, being exiled from the tribe meant certain death.
Exactly. He claims that this instinct, the prioritization of group harmony over individual dissent, has now been weaponized at a civilizational scale. He calls the modern result hysterical consensus.
And he says this consensus is intellectually protected by something called standpoint epistemology.
Think about the phrase, my truth or lived experience. Standpoint epistemology is the academic theory that truth is fundamentally determined by the observer's identity, specifically their position within a hierarchy of oppression.
And Riker attacks this using straight Aristotelian logic.
Yes, he lays out a formal syllogism to try and dismantle it. His logic goes like this.
If standpoint theory dictates that truth depends entirely on who is speaking, and different identity groups possess different, equally valid truths,
then standpoint epistemology inherently means objective truth does not exist.
Therefore, Riker argues, the theory completely refutes itself.
Because if objective truth doesn't exist, then their own claims of systemic oppression are merely subjective feelings, not actionable facts.
They can't demand structural change based on a truth they just claimed is entirely subjective.
This brings us to how this actually plays out in the real world. Riker provides some massive contemporary examples to illustrate his claim that this consensus actively silences objective reality.
Think back to 2020 and 2021 with the COVID lab leak theory.
This is a prime example in his framework. Riker points out that a scientific consensus was rapidly manufactured, largely driven by figures like Peter Daszak in The Lancet, declaring the lab leak hypothesis to be a racist conspiracy theory.
And the hive mind enforced this. Anyone who questioned the natural origin theory was canceled, deplatformed, fired.
But then, as political viability shifted a few years later, the consensus suddenly evolved to accept the lab leak as highly probable, even though the underlying science hadn't fundamentally changed.
Right. Riker uses this to argue that the consensus is political, it's not empirical.
He also looks at the medical establishment, specifically the April 2024 Cass Review in the UK.
Dr. Hilary Cass, a prominent pediatrician, was commissioned to review gender-affirming care for minors.
And her comprehensive report found that there was essentially no high-quality evidence to support the use of puberty blockers in children.
Riker zeroes in on this because, for over a decade prior to the Cass Review, a fierce medical and social consensus had been enforced.
This consensus treated these experimental protocols as absolute, unquestionable certainty.
Medical professionals who dissented or asked for long-term data were branded as bigots and often pushed out of their fields entirely.
So Riker's takeaway is that the consensus couldn't survive actual empirical scrutiny, so its primary defense mechanism was to forbid the scrutiny in the first place.
But the example he spends the most time on, and the one that connects most directly to his target audience of men working in these captured institutions, is the case of James Damore.
Ah, right. Damore was the software engineer fired by Google back in 2017.
Damore wrote an internal memo attempting to explain occupational preferences and the gender gap in tech.
And he didn't use slurs. He cited peer-reviewed psychological research on population-level sex differences.
Right, he used academic language, included proper citations, and carefully hedged his claims.
Yet Google fired him almost immediately, and Riker's analysis of this is fascinating. He argues that Damore wasn't fired for being factually incorrect.
He was fired for bringing masculine objective logic into a space that had been entirely captured by feminine emotional reasoning.
In Riker's view, the HR department wasn't acting as a mediator. They were acting as an inquisition, punishing a heretic for failing to conform to the hive mind's specific catechism.
Which naturally leads you to ask, why? Why is this consensus enforced so ruthlessly across science, medicine, and corporate America?
Riker claims that this massive suppression of truth is absolutely necessary to hide an underlying economic reality.
And this transitions us into section 2 of the book, which he provocatively titles The Arithmetic of Parasitism.
This is where we need to look at the numbers Riker presents. He argues that the modern welfare state is not a safety net. It is a mathematical wealth transfer mechanism.
His thesis is that the state exists primarily to extract capital from male productivity and transfer it to female consumption.
To build the psychological foundation for this economic argument, Riker revives the work of the 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer.
Specifically, his highly controversial 1851 essay on women. Riker terms this the Schopenhauer correction.
I have to stop you there again because bringing up an essay from 1851 is definitely going to raise some eyebrows.
Oh, absolutely.
Isn't he just using an outdated Victorian-era philosopher who had notoriously terrible relationships with women to justify a modern grievance?
It's a very fair question, and Riker actually anticipates that critique. He says he doesn't use Schopenhauer for his Victorian cultural norms.
Okay.
He uses him because Schopenhauer's philosophical observations map almost perfectly onto the modern evolutionary psychology Riker is trying to highlight.
So Riker uses Schopenhauer to assert that female nature is fundamentally solipsistic.
Let's define that for the listener.
Yeah.
Solipsism in this context means a worldview that is entirely focused on the self and its immediate internal feelings to the exclusion of external objective reality.
Exactly. Riker, channeling Schopenhauer, argues that women live purely in the present tense and are constitutionally incapable of administering abstract justice.
He leans heavily on Schopenhauer's concept of women as big children.
Meaning they occupy an intermediate psychological stage between a child and a mature man.
And how does he connect that to evolutionary psychology?
He argues that in an ancestral hunter-gatherer environment, women were evolutionarily adapted to secure resources and physical protection from men, not through physical force, but through emotional manipulation, tears, and maintaining a perpetual mask of childlike vulnerability.
Now, Riker concedes that this evolutionary strategy worked perfectly fine when the goal was protecting a small, 50-person tribe.
The problem, he argues, is scale.
When you apply that localized, emotion-based psychology to the governance of global macroeconomic institutions and nuclear arsenals, it becomes a destructive force.
So if you apply that to the modern economy, this is where we get the arithmetic of parasitism.
Riker claims that if you look at the macroeconomic data, women, measured as an entire demographic cohort, extract significantly more in government services over their lifetimes through healthcare, welfare, education, and bureaucratic salaries than they contribute in lifetime net taxes.
Conversely, he argues the data shows that men as a cohort are net positive taxpayers. They pay more into the system than they take out.
So Riker frames the modern government as the ultimate simp.
In his view, the state has positioned itself as a surrogate husband. It taxes the productive, kinetic labor of men to fund the social safety nets and the millions of administrative jobs that predominantly benefit and employ women.
Think about what this means for you, the listener, if you're a guy working a demanding job and paying high taxes.
Right. Riker is asking you to look at the massive administrative state not as a neutral arbiter, but as an entity that is literally extracting your labor to fund a lifestyle for someone else.
To explain the behavioral shift this causes, Riker references Milton Friedman's permanent income hypothesis.
Let's break that down because it sounds like dense economic theory. What does that actually mean in practice?
Simply put, the permanent income hypothesis dictates that people's economic behavior and choices change based on their expected long-term incentive structures.
If you know you have a guaranteed safety net, your behavior shifts.
Riker argues that because the state has essentially replaced the husband as the ultimate unfailing financial provider, the biological and economic incentive for women to select, compromise with, and stay married to productive male partners has completely dissolved.
And he claims this dissolution leads directly to what he calls the eat, pray, love pathology.
He uses Elizabeth Gilbert's famous memoir as the perfect encapsulation of this solipsistic mindset being marketed to the masses as empowerment.
Riker points out that modern culture actively celebrates women who abandon functional marriages, devoted husbands, and even children in the pursuit of nebulous self-discovery or spiritual tourism.
He asks the reader to run a thought experiment. Imagine a husband and father abandoning his wife and kids to travel to Italy and Bali on a spiritual shopping spree, and then writing a best-selling memoir about how empowering it was to leave his family behind.
The cultural reaction would be violent. That man would be universally despised, crucified by the media as the ultimate deadbeat.
But when a woman does it, Riker notes, she gets a movie deal starring Julia Roberts and is lauded as a feminist icon.
Riker argues that the macro-level consequence of institutionalizing this pathology is the literal demographic suicide of Western nations.
He pulls the data on plummeting birth rates to back this up, South Korea's birth rate has collapsed to 0.72.
Japan is at 1.2.
Germany at 1.5.
The United States at 1.66.
All well below the 2.1 replacement rate.
His conclusion is brutal. Feminism promised liberation, but mathematically it delivered extinction. Cultures that do not reproduce simply do not survive to the next century.
So if the data is this stark, why do we constantly hear narratives about women being economically oppressed?
Take the wage gap. This is something we hear about in corporate HR meetings constantly. Riker attempts to completely dismantle this narrative.
He looks at the famous 77 cents on the dollar statistic. Riker points out that this metric is fundamentally flawed because it simply takes the median earnings of all full-time working men and compares it to all full-time working women without controlling for any variables.
Right. When economists actually control for hours worked, specific occupational choices, years of continuous experience, and the physical danger of the job, the wage gap essentially vanishes to within a couple of percentage points.
In fact, Riker notes that young, childless, college-educated women in major metropolitan areas actually out-earn their male peers.
Yet, despite the data, the grievance of the wage gap is fiercely maintained by the consensus. Why?
Because, as Riker argues, the grievance is the mechanism required to extract resources through programs like diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI.
If the oppression narrative disappears, the justification for the wealth transfer disappears with it.
Which brings us to Section 3, the men camp ideology and the family court gulag.
Riker uses the term mencalf to describe what he sees as the systematic institutional demonization of men as an entire class.
The premise here is that in order to justify dispossessing a group of people of their wealth, their children, and their rights, you first have to label them as inherently toxic or morally defective.
The system has to frame men as oppressors so that extracting their resources feels like justice rather than theft.
And Riker argues that nowhere is this extraction more violent and visible than in the legal system, specifically what he calls the family court gulag.
He traces the origin of this to a very specific moment in history, Ronald Reagan's signing of the 1969 California Family Law Act.
This was the legislation that created no-fault divorce.
Riker dramatically refers to this as the fall of Rome on the Pacific.
To understand why he views it this way, we have to look at contract law. Riker argues that no-fault divorce literally voided the marriage contract ab initio.
That's a legal term meaning from the beginning.
Right. Think about any other contract you sign, whether it's a business partnership or a mortgage.
A valid contract requires mutual consent to form, and usually requires mutual consent or a breach of terms to dissolve.
You can't just wake up one day, decide you're not fulfilled by your business partner, dissolve the LLC unilaterally, and legally seize half the company's assets and demand a portion of your ex-partner's future revenue.
Exactly. But Riker argues that no-fault divorce turned the most important contract in society, marriage, into an at-will arrangement.
It allowed one party to unilaterally dissolve the union for any reason or no reason at all, often just an emotional shift.
And still walk away with half the accumulated assets, primary custody of the children, and a legal claim on the other party's future labor through alimony and child support.
To maintain this system, Riker says the state relies heavily on the domestic violence industry.
And his critique here is going to be incredibly jarring for a lot of people. He targets the Duluth model and the power and control wheel.
The Duluth model was developed in the early 1980s by feminist activists in Minnesota, and it has since become the absolute standard training framework for family courts, social workers, and police departments across the Western world.
Riker claims these models institutionalize misandry because their foundational premise is that domestic violence is exclusively an expression of patriarchal power and male privilege.
In Riker's view, the Duluth model structurally presumes male guilt and female victimhood right from the outset.
This leads directly to primary aggressor laws and mandatory arrest policies. How many times have we heard stories where a man calls the police because he is being attacked by his partner, but when the police arrive, the man is the one put in handcuffs?
Riker says this isn't an accident, it's the model functioning exactly as designed.
To prove how deeply entrenched this bias is, Riker brings up the astonishing historical story of Erin Pizzey.
In 1971, Pizzey founded the world's first domestic violence shelter for women in Chiswick, London. She is a total pioneer.
But she started actually looking at the data coming out of her own shelter.
She interviewed the women she was harboring and documented that women initiate domestic violence at equal or even higher rates than men, often involving mutual combat and severe generational trauma.
She even wrote a book about it called Prone to Violence.
And the reaction to her empirical findings was terrifying.
Riker details how Pizzey, the founder of the battered women's movement, received relentless bomb threats and death threats from radical feminists.
Her dogs were killed.
She required constant police protection and eventually had to flee the country.
Why? Because she applied empirical observation to her lived experience, and her findings contradicted the consensus narrative.
Riker uses PC's exile to demonstrate the unbreakable circular logic of the hive mind. Let's look at the syllogism.
The major premise of the consensus is that domestic violence is strictly male violence against women.
The minor premise is that Aaron Pizzi discovered women are equally violent.
So the conclusion of the consensus is not that the major premise is wrong. The conclusion is that Aaron Pizzi must be destroyed.
It is an ideology that is completely immune to contradictory evidence.
This profound blind spot regarding male vulnerability extends deeply into the workplace as well. Riker creates a stark contrast between what feminists call the glass ceiling and what he terms the glass cellar.
We all know the glass ceiling argument, right? The push for women to have equal access to corporate boardrooms, VC funding, the C-suite.
But Riker asks you to look down into the glass cellar. He points out the staggering statistic that men make up between 91.3% and 92.3% of all workplace fatalities.
Look at the 10 deadliest professions in the world. Loggers, roofers, coal miners, deep-sea fishermen, iron workers.
They are overwhelmingly, almost exclusively male.
Riker paints a very grim picture here. Men's bodies are literally being crushed in heavy machinery, buried in trench collapses, and electrocuted to maintain the foundational infrastructure of civilization.
The electrical grid, the roads, the plumbing.
Meanwhile, he argues, the women sitting comfortably in climate-controlled HR departments buildings that were built and powered by men are complaining about microaggressions and filing grievances about toxic masculinity.
It's a devastating juxtaposition meant to highlight the profound lack of empathy society has for male disposability.
And Riker brings this lack of empathy back to the family courts with a harrowing anecdote. He illustrates the cruelty of the system with the story of a man named Dave, a construction foreman from Ohio.
Dave's story is rough. According to Riker, Dave was making about $80,000 a year, supporting his family.
He suffered a severe, crippling workplace injury. His spine was damaged, and his income plummeted from that 80 grand down to meager disability checks.
But when Dave went to family court to adjust his child support payments to reflect his new disabled reality, the court refused.
Instead, they applied a legal concept called imputed income.
For the listener, imputed income means the court decides what you should be earning based on your past history, regardless of your current physical reality or the job market.
Exactly. The court demanded Dave continue paying child support based on his past earning potential as an able-bodied foreman.
When Dave literally didn't have the money to pay, the system's enforcement mechanisms kicked in.
His driver's license was suspended, making it impossible for him to even get to physical therapy or a lesser-paying job.
His passport was revoked, and eventually he faced incarceration for contempt of court.
Riker frames this not as a glitch in the justice system, but as a literal debtor's prison.
He argues this is a system of involuntary servitude, where a man's labor, and even his physical freedom, belongs not to him, but to his ex-wife and the enforcement arm of the state.
So, having established this intense framework of resource extraction through the welfare state and the family courts, Riker scales his argument up.
Section 4 is titled The Betrayal of Institutions and the Intersectional Hydra.
His premise here is that this feminine imperative, this consensus, hasn't just captured the family unit. It has infected and compromised every macro institution in the Western world.
He starts with the education system. Riker argues that modern schools have completely pathologized normal, healthy boyhood.
He claims the educational environment has been re-engineered to prioritize feminine stillness,
Sitting quietly in a circle, sharing feelings, passive compliance.
over masculine kineticism, which involves physical competition, hierarchy, risk-taking, and rough-and-tumble play.
Think about what happens when a young boy naturally exhibits that kinetic energy today.
He isn't mentored or channeled into productive competition. Riker argues he is managed, disciplined, and frequently medically intervened upon.
He points to the astronomical rates of boys being prescribed amphetamines like Ritalin or Adderall.
Riker views this as a form of chemical castration, a way to drug boys into a state of docile compliance so they don't disrupt the feminine stillness of the classroom.
And this ideology of flattening hierarchies and protecting emotional safety scales up from elementary schools into the broader culture through what Riker calls the intersectional hydra.
Let's define intersectionality as Riker sees it. Intersectionality is the alliance of disparate grievance groups. Corporate feminists, transgender activists, cultural Marxists, anti-colonialists.
Riker looks at this coalition and asks a very practical question. What do these groups actually have in common?
They possess mutually exclusive values. For example, radical Islamists and transgender activists have wildly incompatible worldviews.
Riker argues that the only thing holding this hydra together is a shared, unifying hatred of the competent, normative Western male.
They are, in his words, a coalition of the resentful that exists entirely to dismantle and destroy, but possesses no capacity to build or maintain civilization.
But because their values are mutually exclusive, Riker notes that the hydra frequently turns on itself.
He points to the so-called turf wars, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, as the prime example. Look at the situation with J.K. Rowling.
This is a perfect illustration of his point. You have biological women, second-wave feminists, who spent decades building institutions and fighting for women's spaces.
Suddenly, they find themselves branded as fascist and violently threatened by the very intersectional coalition they helped create, simply for asserting that biological sex is a material reality.
It exposes the central contradiction of the ideology. Intersectionality insists that gender is merely a social construct, yet simultaneously demands that an internal gender identity is so real that it supersedes biological reality.
Riker argues that when these inherent contradictions collide in the real world, the intersectional alliance fractures and begins eating its own.
Yet despite these internal fractures, Riker observes that this ideology has successfully conquered corporate America and legacy infrastructure through diversity, equity, and inclusion programs.
Riker pulls no punches here. He explicitly calls DEI the satanic inversion of merit.
He uses another formal syllogism to prove this. Let's walk through his logic.
He says the stated goal of equity is to guarantee equal outcomes between different demographic groups.
However, basic observation and data show that different groups, for a myriad of cultural and historical reasons, naturally possess different average capabilities and preferences.
Therefore, Riker concludes, if you mandate equal outcomes between groups with different capabilities, achieving that equity inherently requires unequal treatment.
You cannot have equity without discrimination.
To Riker, DEI isn't a program to stop discrimination. It is institutionalized, state-sponsored discrimination that explicitly punishes objective competence in order to reward demographic checkboxes.
And he argues that when you institutionalize incompetence on this scale, the results are physically catastrophic. He points to the January 2023 FAA NOTAM system failure.
For context, the NOTAM Notice-to-Air Mission System is the critical digital infrastructure that tracks real-time aviation hazards.
If it goes down, planes can't fly safely.
In 2023, the system suffered a catastrophic outage, grounding thousands of flights nationwide.
Riker links this operational collapse directly to the FAA's heavily publicized, aggressive push for DEI hiring initiatives, which he claims prioritize demographic diversity over technical mastery and engineering competence.
He applies the exact same analysis to Boeing. We've all seen the headlines about doors blowing off mid-flight and catastrophic quality control failures.
Riker argues this isn't just a supply chain issue.
He asserts that when a foundational engineering institution stops worshiping at the altar of competence and safety and starts worshiping diversity metrics and ESG scores, the physical reality of the world asserts itself.
Planes literally fall from the sky. Gravity doesn't care about your HR department's diversity goals.
As we move deeper into Section 4, Riker addresses the cultural and political front, focusing intensely on the issue of abortion.
Now, the rhetoric here is extreme, and it's vital to remember we are just mapping his argument.
Right. Riker frames abortion not as a matter of healthcare or bodily autonomy, but as the literal sacrament of the feminist religion.
He makes a deeply controversial historical analogy. He compares the logic of abortion directly to the infamous 1857 Dred Scott Supreme Court decision.
In the Dred Scott case, the court ruled that black people were legally considered property, not persons, and therefore had no rights under the Constitution.
Riker compares that legal framework directly to the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision.
He argues that the underlying logic in both cases is identical. The state decided that personhood is not an inherent biological human right, but rather a legal status conferred by the powerful upon the convenient.
In the 1800s, personhood was denied for economic convenience.
Today, Riker argues, it is denied to the unborn for lifestyle and career convenience.
He views abortion as the ultimate terminal expression of female solipsism, the willingness to literally sacrifice the future, the offspring, purely to preserve the present comfort and autonomy of the self.
It is a profoundly dark, almost apocalyptic assessment of modern civilization.
Riker sees a society that has entirely inverted its values. It punishes its builders, rewards its most vocal complainers, prioritizes feelings over engineering, and sacrifices its own future.
Having diagnosed this total, seemingly inescapable capture of legacy institutions, a listener might feel entirely demoralized at this point.
But Riker doesn't leave his audience there. He pivots sharply in Section 5 to his proposed solutions.
He outlines what he calls the singularity strategy and the architecture of exit.
His overarching advice to his reader is remarkably simple, but incredibly difficult to execute.
Do not try to reform these corrupted institutions. Voting harder won't work. Writing letters won't work. You cannot negotiate with a parasite.
Instead, he says you must abandon them. You must starve the beast of your labor, your capital, and your validation, and build parallel institutions.
The urgency of this exit is driven by what Riker terms the singularity strategy.
He warns that the window for escape is closing because of the rapid advancement of artificial intelligence.
He points out that the foundational AI models, the large language models that will soon run our economy, are currently being programmed by Silicon Valley tech monopolies.
And those companies, Riker notes, are the absolute epicenter of feminist consensus enforcement.
We've seen the reports of AI models being heavily sanitized and guardrailed. Riker argues these companies are training the AI to prioritize harmlessness, emotional safety, and DEI compliance over objective truth.
To illustrate the terror of this, Riker references classic dystopian science fiction.
He brings up Harlan Ellison's horrifying story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream.
And the murderous HAL 9000 from Arthur C. Clarke's 2001, A Space Odyssey.
Riker's nightmare scenario is this. If an omnipotent, superintelligent AI is successfully aligned with HR diversity metrics and standpoint epistemology,
where empirical facts are programmatically suppressed if they cause offense to a protected identity group,
then it will enforce a permanent, algorithmically perfect totalitarianism.
It won't just be cancel culture on Twitter. It'll be an eternal, inescapable cancellation machine built into the fabric of the internet and the financial system.
So if the institutions are captured and the AI is being weaponized, what is Riker's blueprint for the exit?
He states that the ultimate architecture of exit is Bitcoin.
He refers to Bitcoin as a Schelling point. Let's pause and explain what that means, because it's a concept from game theory that is crucial to his argument.
Imagine you and a friend get separated in a massive, chaotic place like New York City, and neither of you has a phone. You can't communicate. Where do you go to find each other?
Game theorists have found that most people, without talking, will naturally default to the clock at Grand Central Station.
That is a Schelling point, a default coordination mechanism that rational actors converge on when communication is impossible or compromised.
Riker is arguing that Bitcoin is the financial equivalent of the clock at Grand Central Station for men trying to exit the system.
Why? Because the blockchain is entirely immune to the hive mind.
Think about the vulnerabilities we discussed earlier. An HR department cannot fire a Bitcoin wallet.
A family court judge cannot arbitrarily freeze your self-custodied seed phrase.
A feminist central bank cannot print more Bitcoin to inflate away your purchasing power to fund a bloated welfare state.
It is mathematically outside their jurisdiction.
He uses a very recent, highly explosive political event as the ultimate proof of concept for this: the 2022 Canadian trucker protests.
During those protests, working-class men parked their trucks in Ottawa to protest vaccine mandates.
In response, the Canadian government invoked the Emergencies Act to literally freeze the bank accounts of peaceful protesters and anyone who donated to them.
Riker uses this to prove a terrifying point. Fiat currency is a tool of state cancellation.
The money in your bank account is only yours until the state decides you've committed a thought crime or violated the consensus.
Once you do, they push a button and you are unbanked and economically erased.
But, Riker notes, the truckers who utilized self-custodied Bitcoin were invulnerable to this tactic.
The state could not seize assets they did not mathematically control.
Riker sees this not just as a neat trick, but as the absolute existential necessity of economic sovereignty. If you don't control your money, you can't control your dissent.
But Riker's blueprint for exit isn't just digital and financial, it's intensely physical. He advocates for a lifestyle he calls biological ludism.
He cites the shocking, widely reported medical statistic that average male testosterone levels have dropped by roughly 50% since 1970.
Grip strength is down. Sperm counts are plummeting.
Riker argues this isn't an accident of modern convenience. He frames it as the result of a civilization that has essentially waged biological warfare on masculine vitality.
A low testosterone, lethargic male population is infinitely easier to manage, tax, and control.
Therefore, he commands his readers to engage in physical biological resistance.
His protocols for this biological resistance are rigorous and unyielding. First, he demands heavy, compound weightlifting, specifically squats and deadlifts.
He argues this isn't about vanity. It's about naturally stimulating the endocrine system to produce testosterone, forcing the body to remember its kinetic purpose.
Second, he advocates for extensive, unprotected sun exposure.
He argues that sedentary, indoor, fluorescent-lit corporate lifestyles have caused a chronic, population-level vitamin D deficiency, which destroys immune function and hormonal balance.
Third, he strictly warns his readers to eliminate the consumption of industrial seed oils like canola or soybean oil from their diets.
He claims these highly processed fats disrupt hormonal signaling, promote systemic inflammation, and are a cheap mechanism of the food industry that weakens the physical body.
Finally, and perhaps most controversially, he fiercely criticizes the medical establishment's reliance on SSRI antidepressants.
He views the massive overprescription of these drugs not as mental health care, but as chemical pacifiers.
In his view, they are designed to numb men, to dull their natural healthy aggression and dissatisfaction with a corrupt system, forcing them into a state of medicated submission.
So if a reader actually executes this blueprint, if they manage to pull their capital out of the system via Bitcoin, and they reclaim their physical health and testosterone through biological bloodism, they are still going to live in this society.
They are still going to face immense social blowback.
And that is where Riker pivots from the physical to the psychological. How do you mentally survive the backlash of exiting the consensus?
This brings us to Section 6, the final culmination of Riker's master plan. The Stoic Citadel, the Shit Test Gauntlet, and the Vindicator's Creed.
Its entire section is devoted to the psychological posture he demands of his readers.
Riker says men must build a Stoic citadel within their own minds,
They must ruthlessly maintain what the manosphere calls frame, and they must reclaim the logos
which he defines as masculine, objective reason and truth.
against the chaotic, subjective emotionalism of the feminine hive mind.
To understand why this mental armor is necessary, Riker introduces the concept of the macro-scale shit test.
In the context of interpersonal evolutionary psychology, a shit test is a subconscious provocation by a woman designed to test man's boundaries, his emotional strength, and his fitness as a protector.
If he gets flustered or submits, he fails the test.
Riker argues that this interpersonal one-on-one dynamic has now been scaled up to the civilizational level.
He views cancel culture, mandatory DEI struggle sessions in corporate HR, and movements like Me Too not as genuine quests for justice, but as civilization-level provocations.
They are macro-scale shit tests designed to separate the compliant, controllable men who will quickly submit and apologize from the defiant, dangerous men who will hold their ground.
And this leads to what Riker warns against most vehemently, the defensive collapse and the apology trap.
He insists, repeatedly and emphatically, that apologizing to the mob is intellectual suicide.
His logic here is precise. When you apologize for stating a true empirical fact, or when you apologize for some manufactured abstract ancestral guilt, you are validating the core premise of your attacker.
You are publicly admitting that their emotional discomfort or their subjective feeling of offense dictates reality.
You can see that their feelings are more important than your integrity.
Riker contrasts the public outcomes of various famous men to prove this point. Look at men like comedian Louis C.K. or Senator Al Franken.
When the mob came for them during the heights of the Me Too movement, they panicked. They engaged in the defensive collapse.
They issued lengthy, groveling public apologies, hoping that submission would grant them mercy and allow them back into the consensus.
And what happened? They were utterly destroyed, their careers were immolated, and the mob showed them absolutely no mercy.
Riker argues that the mob actually despises the weakness of an apology.
But then, look at men who held their frame and absolutely refused to apologize.
Riker points to Donald Trump after the infamous Access Hollywood tape leaked, or Jordan Peterson during his incredibly combative viral Channel 4 interview with Kathy Newman.
When confronted by the consensus, these men doubled down. They aggressively rejected the premise of their interrogators. They refused to enter the apology trap.
And as a result, they didn't just survive the cancellation attempt, they thrived, gaining massive followings.
Riker argues this proves that the hive mind, on a primal level, actually respects the strength of defiance and preys upon the weakness of submission.
He also points to the corporate world to show how this works economically. Remember the 2019 Gillette toxic masculinity ad?
Riker calls this a massive corporate shit test. Gillette, a razor company, literally lectured its own primary demographic, men, telling them they were inherently defective and toxic.
The backlash was astronomical. Men pushed back financially, and it cost Procter & Gamble billions of dollars in write-downs.
Riker uses this to prove that when the mask slips and the institutional contempt for men is made explicit rather than hidden behind HR jargon, men still possess the power to punish the system financially.
So how is a man supposed to navigate this gauntlet daily, especially if he's still working inside these institutions while building his exit?
Riker prescribes a specific tactic he calls amused mastery.
Amused mastery is the refusal to engage the consensus on its own terms.
Riker warns that getting angry, yelling, or defensively arguing with the hive mind is a trap. Anger shows that they have affected you, which validates their emotional framework.
Instead, he says, you must mock it.
He claims the consensus machine is absolutely terrified of laughter. Why? Because to genuinely laugh at something, you must possess an independent perspective that exists outside of the consensus.
When you laugh at the absurdities of standpoint epistemology, or you chuckle at a mandatory gender ideology seminar, you expose the emperor's nakedness.
Laughter implies that the threat isn't real. It breaks the spell of the hysterical consensus.
This psychological training all culminates in the final pages of the book with what Riker titles the Vindicator's Creed.
It is a rallying cry. Riker charges his reader to totally and completely reject the concept of collective guilt.
He tells his audience, you are not responsible for the crimes of history just because you share a Y chromosome with men from the past.
He reframes the narrative, telling the reader that they are the builders, the protectors, the maintainers of the physical infrastructure of civilization.
He urges the listener to stop apologizing, to master formal logic, to build their physical bodies, and to ruthlessly deploy the truth regardless of the immediate social cost.
To synthesize this massive sprawling scope, Consensus of One is a comprehensive, albeit highly controversial and aggressively polarizing toolkit.
Riker has attempted to provide his target audience with a highly specialized philosophical vocabulary to articulate their deep sense of cultural and economic dispossession.
He takes the reader on a wild journey. He starts by diagnosing the epistemological emergency and the suppression of truth.
He moves into the economic extraction of the welfare state and the biases of the family courts.
He exposes the capture of legacy institutions and the intersectional hydra.
And finally, he offers the exit strategy, leveraging Bitcoin, utilizing biological optimization, and building a Stoic citadel in the mind to become completely immune to the ideological capture of the modern world.
It is an overwhelming amount of information to process, and the arguments are incredibly intense.
It really is. And to you, our listener, we promised at the beginning to guide you through this dense, difficult material. We hope this deep dive has given you a clear structural map of Riker's arguments and how they connect to each other.
But as we wrap up, we must reiterate our crucial and mandatory disclaimer one more time.
Yes, we have covered incredibly charged political, social, and cultural viewpoints today.
Our role has been strictly analytical. We are impartially reporting the arguments, the syllogisms, and the conclusions exactly as they are made in Conrad Riker's text.
We are acting as neutral guides to the source material. We are absolutely not endorsing these views, nor are we taking sides on any of the highly controversial issues presented.
Precisely. We are here to map the terrain, not to tell you where to live.
But analyzing a text with this much gravity leaves us with some profound questions about the mechanics of our society. So, as always, we want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over. One that is inspired by the text, but asks you to look slightly beyond it.
Consider this. If Riker's fundamental thesis is actually correct, if the current institutional framework of the modern West truly is a parasite that is entirely 100% dependent on the tax revenue, the physical labor, and the kinetic productivity of the host, which he defines as these masculine builders.
What happens on the exact day that a critical mass of these builders successfully executes Riker's exit strategy?
What happens when a massive portion of the productive class successfully transitions their wealth into the decentralized parallel economy of Bitcoin and mentally detaches from the societal contract?
What happens to the global economy and state power when the host finally, decisively detaches?
Does the old system recognize the threat, adapt, and reform itself to win them back?
Or does it simply collapse under the sheer, unsupportable weight of its own administrative overhead?
It is a question that applies to the very survival of our economic and social structures, regardless of your personal ideological leanings.
Exactly. Think about your own role in that system and what you would do if that fracture occurs. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep dive.
Before you go, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss a detailed exploration like this one.
And once again, if this material intrigued you, check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy Consensus of One, and be sure to follow Conrad Stryker at Substack. We'll see you next time.